So we are trudging our way through. We are almost done with 2 Corinthians. We've been here for probably since last summer. We're in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. And we got here. We're going to do one verse we did last week, and mostly because it's kind of like the most important verse in this section. And then we're going to finish this little mini section that's here in chapter 12. The reason why we've done it 2 weeks is, number one, because Roger picked it. And number two, because there's a whole bunch of stuff here. Last week, you may remember that I said that there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in this section. And the reason why there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in this section is because Paul's dealing with the Corinthians, but he's also telling a story about what's happened in his life. So all in the same verses just wrapped up a teaching that God gave to Paul based on something that happened in his life, and also at the same time, Paul then turning around and using that as a foundation for what he's trying to get the Corinthians to understand. So last week, what we did was we just looked at what was happening between God and Paul, and what was happening in his life, and what did God teach him. And then I said this week we're going to take that now and ask, what is Paul then doing with that? So here's the story. He has this vision where he gets caught up into heaven, and he has a vision of heaven, and he sees heaven, but he can't tell anybody anything about it. So he sees God, maybe. He sees heaven for sure, and he has this experience, and then the scriptures say, to keep me from becoming conceited, or to keep me from becoming arrogant, Paul says, I was given a thorn in the flesh. So something, a physical ailment, maybe a spiritual ailment, I don't know. The text doesn't say. He just describes it as a thorn in the flesh. Something to remind Paul to be humble. And Paul says, I asked 3 times God to take it away, and he didn't take it away. Whatever this thing was that was supposed to be a reminder to Paul to not become arrogant, God wanted him to continue to remember, so he didn't take it away. But God gave a response to Paul into his prayer. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that is the thorn in the flesh. Paul says that it should leave me, but God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so last week we talked about how there's a couple reasons why God needed Paul to embrace this weakness. There's a couple reasons why he needed to stay humble, a couple reasons why he needed to present to the Corinthians as what they would describe as weak or unimpressive. There's a couple different reasons. Last weekend, we talked about the first reason. The first is so that Paul continues to experience the power of God. Because he gave this principle, God gave these words to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, meaning you don't need anything else in life to be satisfied. You don't need to be free of all suffering like Paul was trying to be free of this thorn in the flesh. God says it's not about you being free of suffering completely in this life. It's about my grace, my goodness, my kindness towards people who don't deserve it, that being sufficient for you. It's about not God coming in, you believing in him, and then him taking away everything and making life perfect, but more about his grace being sufficient for you. And then the second half of it, God said to Paul, my power is made perfect in weakness. And so we talked about how it's in our weakness that when we rely on God, when we kind of lean into him, that we actually get to experience the power of God, that his power is made perfect. And so God wanted Paul to experience this again and again and again. So he leaves the thorn in the flesh and doesn't take it away from Paul. So that's number one reason why Paul would need to remain humble, why Paul would need to remain weak or unimpressive, so that he can experience the power of God, so that he doesn't become so arrogant that he never needs God, so that he doesn't walk around thinking, I'm smart enough, I got enough money, I got enough experience, I can just do this life thing on my own. But there's something keeping Paul going back to God all the time, saying, I do have weaknesses, and I do need God to be powerful in my life. So then that's kind of the grounding that Paul's working from. And I think everything that he's doing with the Corinthian church all kind of revolves around that understanding that the power of God is made perfect in weakness. So let's look at now what Paul then does. He takes that teaching and now he transitions it into what he's doing with the Corinthian church. And I think this will all start to make sense, what we've talked about in chapter 10, what we've talked about in chapter 11. It will all kind of make sense as to why Paul's acting the way that he is. Second half of verse 9, we kind of transition back into Paul dealing with the Corinthian church. So he gets this teaching from God. God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul says this, second half of verse 9. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. There's a bunch of different ways. There's a bunch of different ways that the Corinthians thought Paul was weak. They thought he was weak because he experienced persecution and hardship. We read the laundry list at the end of chapter 11. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten by rods. 1 stoned. 3 times shipwrecked. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, in the city, in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, and toil and hardship, many sleepless nights. I mean, it goes on and on. See, they thought that meant that Paul must not be walking with God. I mean, if you were really walking with God, God would take care of all these things. You wouldn't be in danger all the time. If you were really walking with God, God wouldn't let you walk through hardships. Why would he let you get stoned? Why would he let you get 40 lashes minus 1? That doesn't make any sense, Paul. But there's this principle that's guiding everything that he's doing. God said to him, my power is made perfect in weakness. See, the Corinthians are taking these things that Paul's now boasting about, sarcastically, and he's saying, listen, if you think that's all weakness, then I'll boast in those things. Because God taught me once that his power is made perfect in weakness. It's all kind of driving what he's trying to teach the Corinthians. They don't think Paul's strong because he doesn't speak eloquently. He even says in the first letter, I didn't come to you with eloquent words in 1 Corinthians. When he's writing them, he says, I didn't come to you with eloquent words or lofty speech. That wasn't my goal. That wasn't my intention. Well, these people who are in Corinth who are now opposing Paul are saying, this dude doesn't even know how to talk. I mean, he gets up there and he stumbles around and he can't figure out what he's saying and it doesn't sound eloquent. It doesn't roll off his tongue. I mean, he doesn't even rhyme. Like, who is this guy? And so they say, Paul, that's a weakness. We don't like it. They don't like the way he physically presents himself. In verse 10, in chapter 10, this is the opposers. He says, for they say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. Unimpressive. He's standing there, and they're looking at him up and down going, dude doesn't look very impressive. So why would we follow him? See, because in the mind of the Corinthians, you want to talk well, you want to present well, you want to be strong. That's what they value. That's what they think power is. But Paul has this teaching from God that the power of God is made perfect in his weakness, and he's clinging to it. No, Corinthians, you don't understand. This is something completely different than what you value. And so he says, if it's true that God spoke to him, saying, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness, then Paul says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weakness. They think Paul's weak because he doesn't argue like them. In chapter 10, he says he wages war, but he says the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. They're a different kind of warfare. He doesn't war like them, and the way that the Corinthians war is they just want to abuse people. They want to tear you down. They want to beat you up. They want to make sure that as far as you go down, then they can be lifted up. And so Paul doesn't fight like them, and they think he's weak because he's not willing to stand there and tear somebody down. And then one last thing, they think that Paul's weak because he won't take their money. for whatever reason, they have an issue that Paul will not accept money from the Corinthian church. See, but everything for these people who are opposing Paul in Corinth is all about money. They want to stand up, they want to present, they want to look well, they want to talk well, and then they're going to pass around the offering plate and say, okay, I won the battle, I won the fight, now you pay me for it. And so obviously when someone comes in sharing the gospel for free, they're like, this guy, he won't even take your money. It's ridiculous. They see all these things as weakness, and this is the things that Paul boasts in. And the reason why he's boasting about them is because he's understood this, that if they're willing to see these things as weakness, then he's willing to say, good. Because I learned this one time, that it's in my weakness that God's power is made strong. You see, all these weaknesses, they're culturally understood. They're what the Corinthians value. And because Paul doesn't share these same values, they're going to call him weak and unimpressive. They don't like that he's coming in being different, showing them a different way. Weakness to them is not abusing people. You're weak if you can't stand up and put somebody down. Weakness is not sounding erudite. Weakness is not taking advantage of people. Weakness is not self-exalting. If you can't do any of those things, then you're just a pretty weak person, probably pretty passive. See, but what I think Paul's getting at, if you look at all the different things that the Corinthians are calling him weak for, everything that the Corinthians call him weak for is something that highlights Jesus. They call him weak because he goes through hardships and he's persecuted. And yet, wasn't it also Jesus that said, if the world hates you, it hated me first? In this life, you'll have trials, you'll have tribulations, but take heart, I've overcome the world. I mean, these are things that God's already told his disciples. The world is going to treat you like this. And the Corinthians play right into it, exactly what Jesus said. And so Paul's saying, look, if you want to call me weak, great. Because that means I'm following then in the footsteps of exactly what God said would happen. Paul's not interested in standing up and speaking eloquent or looking well in front of them, because he says in the first letter, it's all about you looking to Christ. It's not about you, it's not about me standing up here downstairs. Downstairs when I preached the sermon about him being physically unimpressive, downstairs I got to preach in jeans and a t-shirt that weekend. Can you imagine how that went downstairs? The room took a deep breath when I was being unimpressive, like preaching, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and they were all like, oh, that's why he's up there like that. Oh, the whole room was just like, I was like, man, you guys are tense, holy cow. And then we realized that we're all a little bit more like the Corinthians than we would like to admit, right? Because it's uncomfortable when the guy who's supposed to be preaching gets up in jeans and a t-shirt, and you're like, dude, nobody told him. Nobody told him. What is he doing? And yet Paul had no interest in looking impressive. He had no interest in sounding impressive. I've toyed with, in these chapters, getting up here and just not practicing my sermon at all. And just sounding terrible, and then walking off the stage and be like, believe in Jesus, don't believe in me. And I thought, no, that's probably not the way to go about it. But if the Corinthians, if that's what they value, Paul says, I'm not interested in you looking to me and thinking I'm great. I'm not interested in you looking to me and thinking that I have it all put together, that I'm going to save you, or that I'm going to be there for you all the time. There's only one person who can do that. Don't look to me, Paul says, look to God. That's the whole point. And so he's totally comfortable saying, if that's what you think is weakness, then I'll boast in that. Because you will look right past me and you'll look to the one who matters, which is God. Some people may be hung up on, the Corinthians were really abusive, and Paul wasn't interested in abusing people when he spoke face to face. See, Paul won't abuse them because Christ didn't come to take advantage of us. Didn't come to put us down. Didn't come to tell us how terrible sinners we are. He didn't come to tell us how stupid we are. How could you not understand? This doesn't make any, sense. You should be further along. He didn't come with any of that. And so even though the Corinthians want Paul to be like that, he's saying, no, that's not. The guy I follow doesn't do those sorts of things. So if I'm going to give you a picture of him, I can't do those things. It's interesting that Paul won't take money from them. Maybe this is there in the text. Maybe it's just me reading into it. I don't know. But it's interesting that Paul won't take money from them. It's kind of in a similar way that God doesn't take anything from us for our salvation. Right? Paul's not interested in taking their money. He's not interested in what he describes as being a burden to them. I didn't burden you by taking your money so that I could share the gospel with you. He says, I shared the gospel free of charge because I'm not interested in being a burden to you. This is similar for God in our lives. He's not interested in being a burden to us. He's not interested in what can you give me and then I'll share this with you. I think the reason why Paul doesn't want to take their money is because, number one, he doesn't want to be associated with these other people who will just want the Corinthians' money, but maybe even on a deeper level than that, he's interested in giving them a picture of what's actually being offered, which is a free gift. And that's not meant to be a burden. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. Here's what I want to be careful of in this verse. This is a really popular verse. You'll hear this thrown out. People will have this on their walls in their homes. Like you'll hear this verse thrown out all the time. People will try to comfort other people with these verses, and it doesn't work at all. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And I have to admit, when I first came to these verses, I had in my mind that these verses really had to do with our weakness as in our sinfulness. And I think a lot of people do think about these verses. When they hear this that God said, we think, oh yeah, of course the grace of God is sufficient for Paul. Of course it could save him. Of course even Paul. And we go on and on and on about Paul's sinfulness and how the grace of God is sufficient for him and how the power of God is made perfect in redeeming Paul because he couldn't do it himself, and on and on and on. And I've thought that about these verses, and yet reading them in context, I want to be careful. Be careful when you're reading the text that you don't take verses out and just go use them over here off on, and not have a clue how they were actually written. Because I don't know if you noticed in chapter 12 or in chapter 11 or chapter 10, there's no mention of Paul's sinfulness. None. There's no mention of Paul being weak in sin. Everything that Paul lists as weakness is something that the Corinthian church says he's weak, but it's actually pointing them towards Christ. So maybe it's true that in our inability not to sin, God redeems us. And maybe that is an act of power, and that's great. I think those things are true. I'm just not sure that that's what this verse is saying. So be careful when you're reading the text. Be careful that you don't just take a verse out of the middle of nowhere and make it say something that it doesn't. Because it's really easy to do. It's especially easy to do with these texts that we plaster all over everything. So I just be careful as you're reading. Why is it so important? Number 2 reason. Why is it so important that Paul stays meek, stays humble? Last week, it was so that he continues to experience the power of God. You lean in, you rely on God, you get to experience the power of God. Number 2 reason, verse 10. Paul says, "For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." When I'm weak. When I'm weak, Corinthians, by your standards. When I stand up and I don't abuse people. When I stand up and I won't take your money to be a burden to you. When I stand up and I won't look the way you want me to look. When I'm weak by your standards, here's what happens, Paul's saying, is that I display Jesus Christ. So last week, if I'm weak, reality is that forces me to rely on God. When I come to the point where I realize I can't do it on my own, I can't make this happen, I'm not strong enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not whatever enough to figure this out and make this happen, you rely on God, you experience the power of God. At the same time, you embrace your weakness, you also display the power of God. Two separate things happening simultaneously. It's the same thing that's happening in the story. There's this teaching that Paul's giving simultaneously. He's then teaching the Corinthian church, reflecting and teaching. It's the same thing here. Something inside is happening. The power of God's transforming, and you get to experience it. And then on the outside, other people are seeing it. They're seeing it in the form of, you ready? Content. Therefore, for the sake of Christ, then, I am content. You, on the inside, get to experience the power of God, and then you walk around what? Being content. Why? Because there's no reason to fear. I mean, there's no reason to be anxious. You see, I've already seen God do this. No reason to doubt, no reason to go back and forth. No, I've already experienced this in my life, and it comes out as contentment. To which people watch you walk through life, difficult times or whatever, and you're sitting there going, how are you not anxious about this? Like, how is this not just wrecking your life? And you say, well, I was never in control to begin with, and I'm not in control now, so why bother being worried? See, what other people see is the contentment. It's the display of the power of God. Displaying the power of God comes in the form of contentment. Go back to verse 6. We skipped it last week. I told you we were going to come back to it because it has to do with what's going on between Paul and the Corinthian church. Paul's just finished boasting that laundry list of weaknesses, and then he's talked about this vision that he's gotten. And he says, go back to verse 5. He says, on behalf of this man, I will boast, the man who received the vision, which is actually him. He's talking about himself in the third person. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, that's the irony, except of my weakness. And then verse 6 says, though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool because I would be speaking the truth. In other words, this vision that he received actually happened. But I refrain from it so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. In other words, my goal is not for you to look at me. My goal is not for you to look at me and say, wow, he's so great, he's so awesome. We want to just follow him and do whatever he does. He says, no, I don't want you to follow me. Everything that I'm doing is for the purpose of you following Jesus, following God. But he's already learned this, that the power of God is made perfect in weakness. And so what that translates to the rest of the community is contentment. You want to call me weak? Great. And I'll be content with that, to which people will go, what? Yeah. Because the power of God is made perfect in my weakness. This is a paradigm shift, because we live in a world where you're supposed to be strong. I mean, where you're supposed to have it all put together, where you're supposed to never be tired. You're supposed to walk in and, you know, if your face is looking tired, then you just slap a little more makeup on. I mean, this is not acceptable in our culture to walk around showing weakness. And so because of that, we get the two extremes. You get the people who are all put together all the time, and you never hear anything bad happens in their life ever. And even if you do get a glimpse of, like, it's happened a little bit bad, people are just like, oh, God will take care of it. It'll be great. Yeah. Right. Then you get the people on the other end who are like playing the victim. You know, they figured out that nobody expresses weakness, so I'm going to overexpress my weakness so everybody knows about it. Okay, don't go to the other extreme. Reality is we got to be honest about how much things are affecting us. It's not about being here and saying everything's great all the time, because sometimes life sucks. And it's not about sitting over here and saying life sucks all the time. I don't know how you guys live with any sort of happiness, because life is just terrible. But holding some sort of a balance. I got some things in my life that are not going that well, and I got some things in my life and they're going great. You want to talk about those things? I'll be happy. You want to talk about those things? I might not be so happy. But reality is when these things do happen, when God doesn't take away everything in life, that you can still stand there and be like, I'm having a rough time. Life's not that great. I'm struggling with this. But I do know that God's in control. And I do know that although it's really painful, it's going to get me through it. And it might not be for a long time, but He's going to walk with me. The question is, are you more interested about what other people think? Or are you more interested in what Jesus thinks? Are you more interested about them seeing you and thinking that you have it all put together? Or are you more interested in walking away from a conversation with someone or an experience that someone has with you and them going, well, it doesn't make any sense for them to be as content as they are because life is a mess. But they were talking about that Jesus guy, and I don't know about that. Or do you want, when the person walks away from you, do you want them to go, wow, they got life put together all the time, and never, ever make it to Jesus because they're so focused on you? This is different. It's just different than what our culture values. It was different than what their culture valued. Some of you may say, well, I'm interested in both. Like, come on, Anthony, I'm a little bit interested in what my boss thinks of me. I mean, I want to keep my job. I mean, it's got to be some balance to, like, are we interested in what people think of us, or are we just interested in what they think of Jesus? Well, I'm interested in what people think of me, and I'm also interested in what people think of Jesus. So can we find a little balance here? Okay, yes. That's probably the best. But at some point, the world might try to pit them against each other, like they did against Paul. Paul, we think you're weak because you don't present like we present. Paul, we think you're weak because you won't abuse the people you're talking to. And we get this all the time in our lives, right? I mean, like, it's the guy who goes to work and people are like, yeah, we think you're a good guy, you know, we think you're great, you know, but, I mean, really, faithfulness to your wife, I mean, come on. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, we love you, Jack, and all, but that lady has been over there looking at you forever now. What happens when what Jesus stands for and what you stand for, what happens when they get pitted against each other? Yeah, we know that you want to be honest with the boss, but if you are honest with the boss, we are all going to get in trouble because we all screwed up. So why don't you go just in there and tell him what he wants to hear, come back out here, don't throw us under the bus. What are you going to do when you got to go in there and own up to it? Or your employees are going, if you tell them the truth, you're going to get fired. I know, but I already did it. And what happens in the moment when your character and what people think that you should do or live your life is pitted against how Jesus says we're supposed to live? Are you going to be content with truthfulness even though it doesn't make any sense to the world? There's a lot of people that believe that, you know, if you just tell white lies to your spouse, no big deal. As long as they walk away feeling better. Yeah, until they find out you've been lying to them. And then they wonder, if you're willing to lie about small stuff, well, of course you'd be willing to lie about big stuff. And it actually works opposite of how we hoped it would work at the beginning. Are you going to be content with faithfulness? Are you going to be content? Are you going to be content serving people? Listen, you work in the business world, it ain't about serving people. If you're the boss in most companies, it is not about serving the people underneath you. It is about making them do anything that you need to do. You go do the grunt work. You go do that thing because I don't want to do it. How the business world works everywhere. Or are you going to be the person who's willing to say, no, it doesn't matter what position I'm in, I'm supposed to live as a servant. And so even though I'm a boss, I have no problem getting down there and doing their job. Why? Because I'm not above them. So I have a position over them. Who cares? I'm a Christian, so I live as a servant to anyone. Doesn't matter if they're a lesser employee or not. Are you going to be content with that? Are you going to be not just do it begrudgingly, like, this stupid employee can't do what I want them, and I'm just going to do it, and I'll do it myself, and, you just come back tomorrow and try to do it again, but you probably fail. Or are you going to do it with contentment? Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, I'll do this for you. That's great. As long as I show you how to do it too. Are you content not being abusive, or is this too scary? Some people, they're abusive, they don't even know it. But they are out of fear. Because if I give someone else power, they might use it to hurt me. So I'm just not going to give them power. I'm just going to take all the power I can from them. And I'll go on living, and they'll go on living, and it'll be great. Or are you going to be content not being abusive and risking that person maybe having some influence over you? Maybe you get hurt. It's the reality of being in a relationship with someone. Last week, I said, why is it so important that Paul remains humble? Why is it so important that he remains weak? Why is it so important that when he walks into the Corinthian church and shares the gospel with them, because he was the first one to go there and do it, why is it so important that they look at him and they say, we don't think he's very impressive at all? First reason is so that he has no choice but to rely on God. And when he relies on God, he then experiences the power of God. And at the exact same time that's all that is happening, he's relying on God, he's experiencing the power of God, and then he's sitting in this contentment. For the sake of Christ, he says, I am content with weakness, insults, hardship, persecutions, calamities. Why? Because when I'm weak, I'm strong. So you want to call me weak for getting beaten and 40 lashes minus one? Good. You want to call me weak for getting beat with a rod and shipwrecked and in danger all the time? No problem. You want to call me weak for not being abusive? Not looking flashy so that when I stand up here, you all are like, wow, he's great, he's awesome? Yeah, I'll boast in that. Because it is what will point you to Christ. You see, displaying the power of God, it comes in the form of contentment. When the world says you're weak for pointing people towards Christ, the question is, how do you respond? Are you content with your actions? Why you've treated people the way you have? Are you content showing them something besides yourself, or do you just want them to see you? Pray with me. God, we all want to experience your power in our lives. I mean, we'd all want to walk away from our experiences with you and say, yeah, we know that God, and he's powerful. I'm just not so sure that many of us realized, maybe it's just me, God, that at the same time that we're experiencing your power by leaning into you or relying on you, we're also displaying it. That we have, at the same time we're able to admit our weakness and lean into you, we also have the power to display your power. By people seeing that we're weak by the world's standards, but we're not weak by your standards. God, I pray you would change us. Help us to understand that it's not about people looking at us thinking we're so great or awesome. That if they never see past us to you, then there's no hope for them. God, help us to understand that you have the power to work through us That it's not just about us sitting back and saying, oh, God, you do everything. But that you want to show yourself to us, power in our lives. You want us to experience you, but you also want to work through us in the lives of other people. As they watch us do life and walk through difficult times and joyous times. God, would you just work on us? I think this is going to take some time to sink in for us to understand. Would you just work on our hearts piece by piece, day by day, as slowly or quickly as you know we can handle it, God. Thanks that you're gentle with us. Thanks that you're patient with us. Pray all these things in Jesus' name.